Karen. Hello, everybody. My name is Gene Regala, and I'm your MC for this year's iteration of Book Sandwiched In. And as you can see, we're not in the at University of South Carolina here in Beaufort. We're actually from downtown Beaufort, still in Beaufort though, and doing this as a result of COVID. We've decided, and I say we, the board of the Friends of the Library, decided that in the interest of keeping everybody safe, we would move to a virtual effort for the remainder of the sessions going to March 7th. So this is where we'll be for the next several weeks. And we hope that, again, people will join us. We're getting quite a few folks that are joining us that I can see. And that's great. And we've got an interesting group of speakers, as you've been seeing through the slide presentation that's been running while we've been waiting. And there's been a few scheduling changes, as you might expect, with the switch. And one of the things I just want to point out to you is that on February 7th, in place of Rebecca Bruff, who is going to talk about her book, Trouble the Water, Rebecca is going to be, a substitution was made with Jonathan Haupt, who's going to talk about The Water is Wide. And those of you that may know Jonathan, he's the executive director of the Pat Conroy Center. The Water is Wide is a book by Pat Conroy. And it's the 50th anniversary of that book. And he's going to speak towards that in place of Rebecca Bruff on February 7th. And I just, actually, excuse me, February 21st. And my co-host here, Karen Warner, is going to actually present her book, The Sudden Caregiver, A Roadmap for Resilient Caregiving, on February 7th. So February 7th, it'll be Karen in place of Rebecca Bruff. And on February 21st, it'll be Jonathan Haupt, who'll be doing The Water is Wide on that date. So just to make those announcements. One of the things that we're switching up this time too is, you're probably aware that we've done raffles before in the past, those of you that have attended before, but we've decided to actually do a silent auction that's going to be up and running on the Friends of the Library website come February 7th, and will go until we end March 7th. And there we'll have a number of different types of prizes, some of the books. We've got prizes that have been provided by some of our sponsors, such as gift cards. We've got kayak trips. We've got merchandise from various shop owners in downtown Beaufort, and they'll be on the Friends of the Library website for the silent auction. We urge you to take a look at that, and I think you'll find some interesting and fun stuff on there for you. And with that being said, those are the only announcements made for right now. Rather than, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. And his name's Chris Marsh, and he's going to present and talk about The Feather Thief, which is the book for today. And Chris has a tremendous background in biology, zoology, ornithology, and he has quite a distinguished career over the years. He's currently the director of the Spring Island Trust, and also became the director of the Low Country Institute when it was founded that same year out on Spring Island. And he's got an extensive background in environmental science. And just to give you a little bit of his background as far as his academic credentials go, he went to the University, NC State, and graduated, did his undergraduate studies there in zoology. He had clearly an interest in birding going back to when he was 14. He was part of the Raleigh Bird Club when he was 14 years old, which is, again, that's, again, very early interest in birding. And that's certainly something that's carried him through to present day. So he's got a PhD in zoology from Oregon State University. He was an assistant professor at Brevard College in biology. And he served as a professor at Coastal Carolina University, where he taught biology, animal behavior, ornithology, and marine ecology. He's done numerous shorebird studies for the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources and has worked as an environmental consultant. And right now he's, again, at Spring Island. So I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome Chris, and hopefully I did that justice, Chris.
Thank you. Can everybody, I'm just technology-wise, can people see my screen?
We can see you, not your screen.
Okay.
You should be.
Hang on just a minute. Let me see what, okay, let's do my share screen. Okay.
Yeah.
How about now?
Yes.
Right. Okay. So I hope everyone can see the screen I have here that says The Feather Thief, a book written by Kurt Johnson. This book was published in 2018 and has gotten excellent reviews by the New York Times and by multiple friends. So I thought I would use this one. This book
Excuse me, Chris, I'm so sorry. Do you want to make this, play the slideshow like full screen?
Let's see here.
Because
Let me, yeah.
We
Let
see
me
your
see.
thumbnails.
Okay, let's, I gotta remember how to adjust that.
You go to, there you go. And we did one more thing last time.
Hide video panel.
Yes, try that.
Okay. That better?
We can see your slides. We still see the controls at the bottom, like when we did this, right when we were trying it.
Oh, I have to
I can't
reset.
remember what you did. It's fine, we can see it, but you did something before. Hide presenter view, yeah.
There we go. Okay.
There
All
you go.
right.
You're sorry.
All right. Are we set?
Yes,
That look better?
perfect.
Okay. So the book, The Feather Thief, is published in 2018. And it's a fascinating book because it weaves all sorts of stories and connections together. The main character of the story are actually the fly fishing ties that are tied by fishermen using bird feathers. And these have been been done for several centuries. But through that process of talking about these flies, it ties together a very diverse group of people that are shown here. And it weaves through time of over at least 2 centuries. So with that, let's get started with the story. It also occurs in multiple locations around the world. A key place is Tring, England. That's connected to Indonesia and also Papua New Guinea, as well as out on some fly fishing rivers in southern Colorado. There's a timeline to this book, and to understand how all these stories tie together, we really start back in 1653. A very well-known book by hardcore fisherman called The Complete Angler was written by Isaac Walton. And it was the first book to make fly fishing popular to the masses. Notice that this time frame, this is also coinciding with England becoming more affluent. Later in 1842, William Blacker wrote a book called The Art of Fly Making. And this is where people could read the book and get instructions on how to tie your own flies using bird feathers. And Blacker's book had a variety of feathers. You could use feathers from a rooster, you could dye some feathers from a chicken. And so it really promoted the masses to start wanting to go and fish along the streams in England. Right along the same time in the middle of the 1800s, while fly fishermen were starting to hit the rivers of England, there was a huge interest in trying to explore the world and understand and document all the different kinds of plants and animals that occurred. And we're all familiar with Charles Darwin, but there was another person who actually did even more extensive work and is a co-author to the concept of the origin of species, but he never gets mentioned, and that's Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace traveled through South America, and then he made this epic journey that lasted 8 years to the Malay Peninsula in Indonesia from 1854 to 1862. And within that time period, he traveled about 14,000 miles. And basically 2 years of his 8 years was simply spent traveling. Notice how these dates compare to when Charles Darwin published the book, The Origin of Species, in 1859. So we've got both fly fishing and the art of fly making coinciding with the exploration and description of new species that are found around the world. So what about fly tying? Why was this something that was so passionate? People fell in love with the looks of the feathers, but they weren't just tying any feathers together. They were trying to emulate the kinds of insects that would be landing on the water that a salmon or a trout might want to bite. And so they were looking for patterns that match perfectly the insects that occur in different seasons. And throughout the different seasons, there are different insects that are emerging, and it can vary from stream to stream. So this is a highly detailed art, and it's very, very fine work that has to be done. And so it was also something that allowed whoever was making the ties to have a sense of artistry. And so it wasn't just about the feathers, it was about how the fly tyer could actually execute his work. Now, so that's what's happening in the fly tying world. Let's talk more about Wallace and what he was doing. Wallace was sent out thanks to financial support by the wealthy in Great Britain. And he wanted to get to places where other people had not been yet and to describe them. And with all the years he spent in the area around Indonesia, he went to many different islands and he noticed a pattern. And matter of fact, the patterns that Wallace noticed still called the Wallace line in current biology textbooks, because he found an area where, if you look in the lower left-hand corner, those islands to the left or west of these lines were all Asian in descent. Obviously they were related to birds of Asia. However, the birds to the left, or the southeast part of this line, obviously had ancestry related to Australia and New Guinea. Now, this is significant because this is showing that species might be originating or being created in different parts of the world differently. And that's what led him to simultaneously come up with the same idea of evolution, of natural selection, that Charles Darwin did. And from this little island in Indonesia, he wrote a letter in 1858 to Charles Darwin, who had secretly been working on the idea of the origin of species and only let new friends know. And Darwin was shocked when he got this letter in 1858 from Alfred Wallace describing the same theory and the same basic concept he had been working with for 20 years. So this caused a lot of dismay with Darwin because he wanted to do the ethical thing. And so in 1859, one of his friends, the famous geologist Lyell, presented both Darwin's paper and Wallace's paper to the scientific community at the same time. But Darwin's work had been worked on for 20 years. So he is the one that really got most of the credit at that time. During his travels, one of the places that Wallace went was New Guinea. And this is one that will bring Wallace connected to the fly tires. A bird of special interest there was, if you were interested in feathers and absolutely spectacular colors, it was the birds of paradise. And so here, these birds of paradise are only found in New Guinea and the surrounding islands. Here's the great bird of paradise. And you can see why someone who is interested in diversity of birds would be attracted to this bird, and also why people who are who are tying flies and want feathers of different colors would be interested in this bird. So what we have now is we've got this stage set that through the 1800s, there's now great demand to go out and collect as many of these brightly colored birds as possible from these places that used to be totally out of reach of Europe, but now collectors are paying money for them, and there's a huge market. So not only did the fly tyers and the scientists want to collect specimens, but well, let me mention about the specimens. The specimens that Wallace collected were sent back to the British Museum of Natural History, the British Natural History Museum. And what scientists do when they collect birds, that's a nice way of saying they shoot them, is that they want to preserve specimens for antiquity. And so there's not room to store them in all mounted positions, so you make what we call a study skin. During my college years, I was trained to be a bird skinner, to make bird skins just like you see here for the North Carolina State Museum of Natural History. And so this is part of my professional training as I went through. What they do is they basically, what you have left is you make a little incision on the belly of the bird, and you pull just the skin off the bird with the feathers attached to it, and the skull stays in, and the key bones stay in. But then the rest of anything that could decay is removed, and you replace that with cotton. So when you look at these birds, they either have a little stick or something inside, and they have cotton eyeballs. And once you do this, a specimen like this can last for hundreds of years. So within the British Natural History Museum are specimens from Charles Darwin, the original Galapagos finch series is there, and also Wallace's collection from his 8 years in Indonesia are there. And scientists find these very valuable because, for example, if you wanted to look for lead detection and what were the lead conditions like today versus in the 1800s, you could collect a single little small feather off one of these study skins, analyze it, and be able to go back in time to see what the conditions were like there. So these are, from a scientist standpoint, extremely valuable pieces of our history going back several hundred years. Now, from a fly tyer standpoint, those are wasted birds. They look at all these drawers of specimens and they say, well, look, you've got lots of them. What does it matter? You're just hoarding them away and they're not being used for science. And so, good grief, look at all these brightly colored birds and think about the number of flies you could tie with one of these. In the same time, other people fell in love with feathers. And I think this is one of the themes and one of the things to take away from this book to make you start thinking about it is, why are people so attracted to the colorful feathers found on birds. And it's really a connection to nature. But our human eye, how we define beauty, is based in nature. And this is a black and white picture from around 1900, but this is the same great bird of paradise that was mounted up on a woman's hat. And I think we're all familiar with the plume trade and how hats were adorned with birds of all different kinds, as well as feathers. The book goes into it more, but it was really the women who started the conservation movement. And it all started with protecting the birds and their feathers. So if you want to learn about how women played a role in conservation of birds, then you certainly should read this book. So we're now up around the turn of the century, at the beginning of the 20th century. And a key player in the story we have here is an English playboy called George Mortimer Kelson, who was a fly tyer extraordinaire. And he wrote a book called The Salmon Fly. And within that book, the way he described fly tying, he made a huge deal about how important it was to use the best feathers possible. That a dyed duck feather was no comparison to a feather off a great bird of paradise, or a lovely cotinga, or a magnificent quetzal. And so this book sort of did for feathers what the Chinese market has done for like rhino horns and other things, where they claim that there's aphrodisiac type properties and make people want to seek things that are rare and hard to get. It was Kelson really helped initiate the desire to go after rare bird skins. About the same time, this was when the conservation movement was becoming established. And just to give you some timelines, from 1900 to 1922, there were a series of legislation, starting with the Lacey Act, that gave progressively greater protection to the banning killing birds, and also trading or exporting bird skins and plumes. And so people often say, oh, why is it illegal to have an eagle feather or a feather from a red-tailed hawk? It all started because the fact that the original reason birds were being killed were not for the whole bird, but to get the feathers. Ultimately, this led to, in 1933, to an international ban on trading feathers. And in 1973, the Council on International Trade of Endangered Species, the CITES, council was established. That's still in place today, and that is the international organization that determines which species should be listed as endangered throughout the world. We bring all these up because throughout this whole period, the appetite for having rare bird feathers and using them for tying flies continued, and also almost expanded as the number of people interested in fly fishing, and more importantly, they're not so much about the fishing, the art of tying these spectacular flies, which all began with Kelson's book. So now we have the stage set where that even though there are laws in place, there is a very strong black trade on rare bird skins and feathers. And basically people were trying to rely on the fact that if they found old mounts from an auction of somebody in England who had gotten birds back in the early 1900s, those were considered legitimate. But this was a very limited market, and therefore, of course, price and interest increased. And from a fly tyer standpoint, this is what they were looking for. They were looking for the individual feathers that they could use to put on the market. And you can go to eBay. A lot of this trading more recently would even occur on eBay, and you would not be buying a bird skin necessarily, but just a little pack of feathers that you could use for your tie, for your fly tying. So let's return now to present day times. And what we have is we have these large vaults of bird skins that are highly sought after by fly tyers, and also coveted and very much appreciated by the scientific community. And this particular museum is located in Tring, England. The British Natural History Museum, even though people think of it as being located in London, actually its bird skin collection is located in Tring rather than London. And so that's one of the key places where this story unfolds. What happened is that on July 28th, 2009, what we call the heist, somebody broke in a month earlier on June 23rd into the Tring Museum and stole a bunch of birds. They stole bird skins. The staff, they carefully closed the cabinets back so that no one could tell that the skins were gone. And so it wasn't until over a month later that they discovered that there were missing skins. They immediately ran to check to see if the thief had also stolen the Charles Darwin Galapagos finch specimens, but they were untouched. They also had bird skins that were done by John James Audubon. Those were not touched. It turned out they were all the birds that were quite colorful that were stolen. What was stolen was 299 specimens from 16 different species, blue chatterers, an Asian bird, flame bowerbirds from New Guinea, magnificent riflebirds, a type of bird of paradise, superb birds of paradise, the king birds of paradise, which I showed you, the resplendent quetzal, which is found in South America and the Central America, as well as Indian, what they call Indian crows, which have very ornate plumes around their throat. And I put this title, this list up for a reason. When it all came about, it turns out that the culprit, the thief, was a young man named Andrew Trist, who at this time is 22 years old. And so to understand how this came about, a good part of the book looks at Andrew's life and his role. And I'm just going to give you some little key points to let you know what was going on. He was born in 1988. In his teen years, he got a fascination of feather tying, and he was also a master flute player. He grew up in the United States. So how in the world did he get from the United States to Britain? You have to read the book, and it'll tell you that. But ultimately, through the combination of his interest and his passion for flutes and feathers, he ends up and is responsible on record, we'll put it that way, for the heist. The other thing that happened is not too long after, Edwin Twist starts selling small bags of individual feathers via eBay. And this is how they were able to backtrack and find who the culprit was. And it was over almost exactly a year later that he is arrested for this crime. Now then, once they got into his room, they recovered some of the skins. And so the woman on the left is the detective who was responsible for the investigation. And then there's two people associated with the museum as far as curators, the birds in the trays. The one on the left there, I told you about the Indian crow. Those are Indian crows that have those brightly colored feathers. And the bird they're holding up is a resplendent quetzal. specimen. So part of the whole book is dealing with what happened to the skins, as well as doing a magnificent job of laying out the story of conservation in this country, and also the development of Darwin and Wallace's idea of natural selection. So I just want to stop here for a moment. And while it's called The Feather Thief, if you want to get a great overview about what conservation was like through the 1800s and 1900s, it's all woven together beautifully by author Johnson. So of the 299 skins originally stolen, 125 were gone. They were missing. They retrieved 72 skins in his apartment, but they lacked their labels. And without a label, a study skin is considered almost worthless by scientists, because it's knowing where did it come from? Why did it have that particular coloration? Which subspecies was it? When was it collected? So you could have a date. So these skins were, while they were retrieved, they were considered a loss by the museum. So from all that perspective, the museum felt like they only recovered 102 specimens that were of value. Given the value of each of these, the question then became, where were the other 125 skins that Edwin had originally taken out of the place? And this becomes part of the story for the latter part of the book. The author, Kirk Johnson, is a very interesting person himself. It's written in the first person. He, if you look at it, he had been in the Middle East and involved with refugees and helping relocate people who had helped American troops there, and was totally burned out and started fly fishing as a way to help his mental state. And so he became absolutely hooked on fly fishing as a way to relax. And it was while he was fly fishing in southern Colorado that he heard the name Edwin Twist for the first time. And that's what started his investigation, which is what the book is all about, was his story of following all the different leads. Two other characters that come into the story that I'm just going to give you a little bit of information about to encourage you to read the book further, is that Edwin had a friend, Lon Ning, who was also an absolute expert in tying flies, but he lived in Norway. And this is what the internet did, was connect people. And he plays a role in the story because one of the things that Johnson describes in the book as you go through is that Edwin's story, when he was in court, made it clear that he was the sole person responsible for the theft. But there's some things that don't add up. And one of the questions I'm hoping you're asking is what became of Edwin himself, because he was 22 at the time. Well, you're going to have to read the book there, because there's all sorts of unusual twists that occur that relate to Edwin and the judicial system in England that I think many of us could relate to or find interesting. A character that comes into the story late, but plays a pivotal role, is Dr. Stuart Pym. I know of Dr. Stuart Pym because he was one of the true frontier scientists who didn't just study conservation, but took a very active role in trying to preserve populations of new tropical birds. He worked with the government of Brazil, and he was extremely proactive in trying to help understand what needed to be done to protect neotropical birds. And it turns out that he comes into the story as well, as a result of what he knows about feathers. So with all these feathers that are occurring and moving back and forth, what I wanted to do here with this with the last part here is talk about a phrase that was coined by the fly tyers. When they got all these feathers together, they called it feather porn. And it was obviously the visual overload. And there are events, just like there are feather shows. There at least were where all these fly tyers come together. It's been in New Jersey and other places, and they show their wares. And they put them out. Now, one of the things that comes out of this book is that you can still go to eBay and you can still buy feathers for fly tying from species of birds that are listed on that site's endangered species list. So in other words, they're considered contraband. But this is a black market and no one talks about it. And so people who are hooked on this particular type of hobby see all these restrictions and bans on importations and all as a large inconvenience, and they think it's sort of overblown. At the same time, what I want to show you is that people don't have to be fly tyers to look at pictures like this and be attracted to them. So it seems to me that there's parallel ways that people stay engaged with nature. And just to illustrate this, there's been very much of a market of increased interest of people to travel to the tropics in order to actually see the whole bird and to get into bird watching. And one of the birds that you're likely to encounter in Costa Rica is the quetzal, one of the birds I showed you before. Matter of fact, I was down there, and 2 weeks ago I made this little video. Let me see if it'll play. And to give you an idea, that tail feathers are 3 feet long. And one of the things that you find when you go to Costa Rica is that it becomes the bird to see. So this is a group of birders that are waiting for the quetzal to show up. It came into a tree that has the right kind of fruit. The bird sits there and feeds on this fruit for a little bit, and then it flies off to go digest it. And the next group, people continue to gather, and they're all waiting for the bird, one of the birds, the males, to come back in order to get its next meal. I was surprised when I was there is that some of these people don't even have binoculars. What they're with a guide, and they're staying in a lodge to get a nature experience. And so they sign up just to go see a quetzal. And the guide has a telescope, a birding telescope, like you see in the foreground, and they get to see a quetzal, even though that wasn't the main reason they came on the trip. So people today still are drawn to feathers, and they're drawn to the birds. And so here we have a situation where there's conflicting views about how feathers should be used. But fortunately, I think the story is great that people such as those in Costa Rica now see that protecting these birds is very important to their economy, because ecotourism is a major driver. So about 8 years ago, Costa Rica banned hunting altogether. And the youth that are being raised there now see these as an amenity that both for themselves, but also for their economy. And just to show you a little bit more of that culture, I'm going to show you one more video here. They've set up feeders just to give you an idea what these feathers look like rather than in a drawer when they're on the bird themselves. This is a Chloriphonia that they've set up a station up on a hillside, and people who stay in the lodge can go up and take their pictures and enjoy watching their birds. And so here's a silver-throated tanager. And so you have all sorts of birds like this that continue to thrive in these areas thanks to conservation efforts. Indonesia, on the other hand, is suffering major deforestation. So those species are in a different situation. So with that, I'd like for you to be thinking about what draws people to nature. It is as if our brain is programmed to want to connect to nature. How we define beauty is defined by what is present in nature. And so the book, The Feather Thief, is a book where all that is brought together. And it ties in conservation, it ties in geography, it ties in history, and it also causes us to ask the questions about why do some people become so passionate about something that they'll compromise their morals or justify them, so to speak, in order to fix their desire to have something that brings them visual satisfaction. So with that, I'm going to stop and turn it back over to the moderators and see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Chris. If everybody remembers, or if they've watched the program or the PowerPoint presentation earlier, it shows you that if you have any questions, you can go into the chat icon at the bottom of the screen, and you can actually type your questions in if you'd care to do that. Or we can probably take questions live if you unmute, and you can ask your question directly, whatever you prefer. But does anybody have any questions for Dr. Marsh?
I see one that had been typed into the chat room about, it says, as a naturalist, how did you feel reviewing a book on the frivolous killing of birds for their feathers? I think one of the things about it is that actually I was raised in the museum industry and had a fascination for bird skins and studying them. And so I knew what was going on in terms of collecting bird specimens. I also know that back in the 1800s, they thought that, there'd always be plenty of birds, just like people always thought the ocean has so much water, you can never pollute it, or people think, oh, there's so much air, you can never pollute it. So I understood that. What I was shocked at, quite frankly, was that I'm surprised, but not. There is such limited resources to enforce laws that protect endangered species that, as they point out, when you're trying to deal with snow leopard pelts or people trading, baby animals or rhinoceros horns of things that are getting ready to go extinct, trying to chase down, feathers at a convention just was not on the radar for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They just are understaffed. So I think my biggest surprise was that while we have laws in place, apparently there's still pretty flagrant disregard for them in terms of if you really want something, eBay and the internet can help you get it.
We have a question from Beth. Fascinating, can't wait to read the book. How are most flies made now, if not with real feathers?
They are made with real feathers, but you have to think about like domesticated chicken, waterfowl, all those species that it's perfectly legal to hunt. There's a huge variety of colors and patterns that come off wood ducks and other things like that. So they're still using feathers, but they're using ones from species that it's legal to hunt or to raise.
Hey, Chris, I have a question. I'm a retired FBI agent, and one of the things that we would sometimes get into is the Migratory Bird Act.
Mm-hmm.
And I know we've had a number of investigations in years past working with the Fish and Wildlife Service in the selling of birds and anything related to that. Have you had any involvement?
I have not done anything directly. I'm aware the Spring Island Trust Fund studies on painted buntings. And so I keep up with the painted bunting research team, and we know that approximately 10,000 birds a year get captured in Central and Mexico and Cuba and are sold in the pet trade for cage birds. And that there's a lot of these painted buntings now are wintering in South Florida, and there's major rings of people who are catching birds and selling them because it's such an important, traditionally part of the Hispanic culture. So I just know about it secondhand, but I haven't had any direct ties with it.
We have a couple more questions. What is eBay's responsibility here? Can they be held accountable?
The author talks about eBay and reaching out to them and having mixed success there. I think one of the key problems here is the fact that you're not dealing with a whole bird skin sometimes. Often is the fact that a little group of feathers, how can you evaluate that? You have to be an expert to know what it is. So somebody asked, what sentence did Trist receive? You have to read the book, because that's a part of the plot of the book, is the twists and turns that go related to what Edwin Trist did. I will say that the author interviewed Trist and sat down and had a lengthy interview with Trist and with his friend Long. So what's unique about this book is the author is also part of the story, and it weaves it all together.
Did you enjoy the book?
I very much so. When I get home at the end of the day after looking at computer screens, I usually can't read books. But once I picked this one up, I stayed up past my bedtime, which is 9 o'clock, several nights, because I just had to get through it. So it's a very, very well written book, and it's one of those that you just want to keep up with the story. So it was very enjoyable to read.
Chris, I'm curious about what the overlap is between your interest in birds, the feathers, and your work at Spring Island.
Well, one of the things we talk about is if we can get people interested in bird watching, then what happens next is that they become interested in where the birds live and what the birds need. And so that's a great way to take someone who is just attracted to the beauty of birds and their unique behaviors and make them into conservationists and environmentalists. And so that was my path. The more I studied birds, if you want to find certain birds, you got to know exactly what their habitat is, what time of year it is, why are they there, and you really get to know your natural landscape well. And by getting to know the natural landscape well, it becomes a good friend, and then you start seeing things and what people are doing to it that make you want to protect it. So that's one of the reasons why so many environmental nonprofits are interested in helping get kids or interested in bird watching, or backyard birders interested in birds, because it's the gateway to conservation.
Thank you.
Chris, we got an additional question here. Did you learn anything new from this book?
I did. I did not have any idea about fly tying as far as using these fancy feathers. My brother-in-law is a fly fisherman, and he ties flies, and I know he's using wood duck feathers and things like that. So I'd always just thought of it as using the feathers that you have at hand. I had no idea that there was such a demand for these rare feathers as well. The other thing I really appreciated reading this book as someone who's interested in conservation was Johnson does a great job of tying and telling in very simple form the story of bird conservation in this country and in Europe and England, and showing how the two are parallel. So even for people who know quite a bit about conservation, I think they would enjoy the read because it clarifies things. The other thing that he described that I hadn't seen before was exactly how women and the times made it so that the plume trade shut down. And he talks about how much conflict there was in the early plume trade because there were 10,000 people employed as milliners in cities that relied on feathers for their jobs. And so there was a labor union that was fighting against the Lacey Act and these laws that would restrict access to feathers. So, it's times haven't changed. There was a cause that people believed in, but there was also a group of people that had built their occupation on that. And so if you're interested in history, it's another example of how the conflicts go about, how they're resolved.
Great.
Thank you so much. It's been great. I really enjoyed it.
And
Good.
Are people able to unmute themselves? You can unmute yourselves and either ask a question or praise Chris, whichever you feel like doing.
Well, I already wrote this, but it's fascinating and I can't wait to read the book.
Yeah. And obviously for those people here, the author isn't too bad looking in his picture. I don't know what he looks like now, but
Yeah.
he could sell some copies probably in certain parts. Putting a feather up there. So he has a very interesting story too. He makes it very personal.
Yeah.
So
If anyone prefers,
Okay, it's off, that's alternative.
Yeah, it's just got my name up there.
Oh, okay.
I was on there for a minute.
I saw
Um,
Daisy, people
yeah.
are raising their hands.
hey,
So somebody,
Chris, thank you. That was awesome. If anyone prefers audiobooks, which I do, you can get it for free on Libby. You can download it off of the library app. So
Gina, I said, Jean Bray has a question.
That's how high it's gonna get today.
I read the book. It's absolutely fascinating. And as a birder, I come from New York State and I feed the birds year round. And it's such a wonderful thing to read a whole different concept of what went on, particularly with the ladies and their fancy feathered hats and whatnot. I really, truly enjoyed the book. It was a lot of fun to read.
Thank you for sharing. All righty.
We have
Well,
time for one more question maybe before we
I have a question.
head, man.
With the overdevelopment of Beaufort County right now, Chris, are you fearful of any particular bird being lost because of our habitat loss?
The big concern that we have is that it's not just habitat loss, but the fact that so much of this county is been suburbanized and that these large residential areas are using non-native plants.
Mhm.
And so if you wanted to make a big difference, I think if we can get people, and this includes municipalities and communities, to not have restrictive ordinances that prevent you from having wild areas in your backyard. So for example, the eastern towhee is a bird, or what we used to call rufous-sided towhee, is a bird that's disappeared through much of the county because it needs areas where there's leaves. But manicured lawns do not provide habitat for birds that, for those of us that grew up before there was a lot of chemicals and people actually had lawn care companies, if you just had if you had a lawn in the front yard and the backyard was just wild, then there were still a lot of birds that could survive there. But I think having manicured lawns, turf grass is the #1 enemy of bird populations. So there's a place for it, but if you could keep it restricted and limited where you have it walking and all, that would be probably the biggest thing that you can do as far as making a difference in a large part of the community, particularly south of the Broad, but also in any of these other communities out on Fripp and Harbor and northern Beaufort County as well.
Thank you.
Chris, we're getting a lot of good feedback saying it's a great presentation and folks really enjoyed it. So thank you for your time today, and we enjoyed having you. And thank you everybody for coming and joining us for Book Sandwiched In, and we hope to see you next week. And next week's book that we're going to be taking a look at is called High on the Hog, A Culinary Journey from Africa to America. And that's going to be presented by Marilyn Harris. So we'll be here same time next week on Monday, 12 o'clock. And we hope to see you back here then. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris.
Bye now.